Good afternoon. All right. I want to thank everyone for joining us today as we take time to acknowledge, honor, and celebrate, and most importantly, listen and learn from some very important women in politics today. Since the nation's founding, political power has been synonymous with a singular mold, a mold that lacked diversity of thought and was detrimentally exclusive. Singularity and exclusivity do not birth effective leadership. And effective leadership is ever evolving. It is trustworthy and it must be inclusive. 102 years ago, 50 years after Howard University's founding, and 2 years before some women won the right to vote in the US, the first woman was elected to federal office. Today, there are more than 100 women serving in both chambers of the 116th Congress. And let's give them a round of applause. And for those of you in here who voted for them, why don't you give yourself a round of applause as well? I want to take a moment to acknowledge Dr. Alvin Thornton. He's a former provost at the university and senior administrator who is now the school board chair in Prince George's County. We thank you for joining us today. The 2018 midterm elections ushered in a shift in representation and flipped the once unilaterally accepted mold of political power on its axis. And some of the women who join us today personify that shift. Although Congresswoman Bass was re-elected to her 5th term representing the 37th Congressional District, prior to serving in Congress, she made history when the California Assembly elected her to be its 67th Speaker, catapulting her to become the first African-American woman in U.S. history to serve in this powerful state legislative role. So we thank you for being here with us, Congresswoman Bass. Prior to being elected to the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Clark served on the New York City Council representing the 40th District in Brooklyn. She succeeded her pioneering mother, former City Council member Dr. Una S.T. Clark, making them the first mother-daughter succession in the history of the City Council. So congratulations to you as well. And her district also covers part of Church Avenue, where I once was a dollar cab driver. But we'll discuss that after. I think the statute of limitations on that is passed. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, now in her 15th term as the Congresswoman for the District of Columbia, is the chair of the House Subcommittee on Highways and Transit. She serves on 2 committees, the Committee on Oversight and Reform and the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. In the 1990s, Congresswoman Norton helped end the city's most serious fiscal crisis in a century. And she certainly is our hometown Congresswoman, and we will continue to work with her as she probably is the most passionate person about seeing that the District of Columbia becomes a state. So we appreciate you very, very much. And finally, although she's not able to be here with us today, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley is the first black Congresswoman for the state of Massachusetts, and again, another ceiling breaker. These women are dynamic, qualified, needed, and shattering glass ceilings to ensure the pieces are never put back together again. These women reach back and pull forward. My passion for inclusivity in leadership, and specifically my persistence to place women in leadership roles across the university, is a direct result of experiences that have allowed me to witness a wide breadth of this institution through a plethora of lenses. In my role, I found it necessary to ensure that the leadership better reflect our student body as well. When I started, we had 1 academic dean who was a woman, and I'm glad to say today, currently, 10 of our 13 academic deans are women, as well as 5 of 9 members of my executive cabinet. And if any of them are here, they can stand so we can recognize them. I must also take the time to thank the holder of the Gwendolyn S. and Colbert I. King Chair in Public Policy, Donna Brazil, who will step up to the podium in a second. Her passion certainly has ignited necessary and robust discussions on our campus. And I hope everyone in here agrees with me that this year that she has spent with us, we should turn into a more permanent role. Don't you think so? All right, so no pressure. And the Kings are with us here today. I know they don't like to be acknowledged, especially every time we have one of these. And so because of that, I'm going to be presidential and break protocol and ask both of them to just stand so we can acknowledge their kind gift and their kind stewardship of the King Chair. And for the students in here, they're both alum who have made a seven-figure plus gift to the university in order for us to be able to do this. They met each other here at Howard and certainly have been very good stewards. And so we were also honored to give both of them honorary degrees recently as well. So thank you all for being present. I look forward to listening myself and learning from and celebrating these exceptional and extraordinary women. So with that in mind, I would bring the new Fox News contributor, talk about diversity and balance, to the podium, and Ms. Donna Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. It's a great honor to be here. This is my first week as a Fox News contributor, and as you can tell, I'm still a cougar woman. It is my great honor to welcome each and every one of you here to celebrate Women's History Month. We celebrate women of valor, women of courage, women who have made a difference in our lives. And indeed, three of the women who are here today are not only my friends, my mentors, but they have all made a difference in the lives of so many Americans. It is my great honor to bring them to stage. The Honorable Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton from the District of Columbia. I've had the honor of, Eleanor, I think, is it this way? Great. I'm still trying to tell Eleanor what to do. Sorry about that, Congresswoman. The Honorable Karen Bass from the great state of California, the 37th District of California, and the Honorable Yvette D. Clark from the 9th Congressional District of the great state of New York. Please join us on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, we had the honor of Ayanna Pressley, a freshman member elected from the 9th District in the great state of Massachusetts. Let me just read a statement from Congresswoman Pressley. To my fellow table shakers, justice seekers, and truth tellers, I so wish I could be with you today to discuss the entrenched inequities and disparities facing our communities. As luck would have it, I had an accident. At home in Massachusetts this weekend, I tore my MCL, severely affecting my mobility. However, addressing the issues of consequence facing Black Americans is one of my top priorities here in Congress, and I hope there will be another opportunity to partner with you all once I'm fully healed. I cannot wait to come and visit the students here on the campus of Howard University. She says to Gwen and Colby Kane, thank you for this great opportunity. We must never forget that it is our responsibility as activists, as advocates, and as members of the community to make a point to discuss all of these issues. Issues such as voter suppression, the school-to-prison pipeline, the maternal mortality crisis, and what reparations mean for Black America. A young person once asked me, and I quote, "Do Black lives only matter in election years?" End of quote. Forums like today prove that Black lives matter every single day. Mr. President, sending lots of love and gratitude your way for participating in today's event, and with gratitude to all those in attendance, Ayanna Pressley. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get started by asking each of the congresswomen to tell us in 1 minute or less, they're familiar with the 1-minute rule. I would like them to share with you their own story of why they decided to run for political office and what role has any woman played in their lives, including mentors, in helping them begin their journey in public service. Thank you. I'll start with the Congresswoman from the District of Columbia.
May it please the court. First, all praise to Gwen and Colby King, who have given back to this university and given so much to the District of Columbia. I just want to say as well how pleased I am to be here at Howard University because I represent Howard University. And it is a great honor to represent this first among firsts of our HBCUs. And to appear once again at Howard is always a privilege. Donna, let me say to you, Donna was my chief of staff for 10 years. until she flew off, she thought, for bigger and better things. Now, you asked me to say what? I mean, I think that's enough, but.
Well, Eleanor, you were inspired by Fannie Lou Hamer. You encountered her at such an early age. As a graduate of Dunbar High School, Antioch College, and of course Yale Graduate School and Yale Law School, you went down to Mississippi during that terrible summer. What role did Fannie Lou Hamer play in your life in helping you become the public servant that you are today?
Don, I really appreciate that question because I know that people always cite some great hoity-toity woman, but if you were in the civil rights movement as I was and in Mississippi, and the first thing that happened to you when you got there, remember they were teenagers, I was just above that, and they said to you, because I was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you're the oldest person here now. I said, what? Everybody else has gone here or there. And Fannie Lou Hamer has been put in jail. So you need to tell us what to do. I said, well, I just got here 5 minutes ago, but, and I was a second-year law student. I couldn't pretend to be a lawyer, and to show you how needy they were of lawyers, they were very pleased to have anybody who had a taste of law. And so I said, tell me about, I did what lawyers do, even though I wasn't yet a lawyer. I said, tell me about everything in this place so I'll know how to do this. And they said to me, well, the White Citizens Councils picket every other night. I said, well, that won't help us. They said the police chief keeps peace. He's a racist, but he's a decent man. I said, take me to your police chief. And I went over to meet with the police chief. And I said, my name is Eleanor Catherine Holmes. I was not then yet Norton. And I said, I have just come from Washington, D.C. Everybody knows I'm here. The dean of the Yale Law School, my parents, my friends. So I'm not afraid to be here. But the moment I arrived in Mississippi, they told me that one of your native daughters was in jail. Now, the person that went to get Fannie Lou Hamer out of jail, a young man named Larry Giott, I am told was himself put in jail. Now, I don't have any recourse but to go there. And I'm asking you to call Winona, Mississippi, and tell them I'm coming, and I do not expect to be put in jail for coming to post bail for Fannie Lou Hamer. And I went over. I was not put in handcuffs. I said, could I see Larry Giott, who was the SNCC worker who had preceded me? Lawrence Giott, they had no clothes on him. They had to put a sheet on him because they had let him out that night before to the Citizens Councils, and they had beat him and then taken him back. So I saw that he was alive, and then I saw Miss Hamer. She was alive, but she had been beat by a trustee. Now, imagine a black man put in the position of saying, you better beat her hard, or just wait and see how hard we're going to beat you. Well, I saw how hard they had beat Fannie Lou Hamer. But I was spared being beat, largely because I went to the police chief. So I was not out of law school yet, and I don't think you had to have gone to law school to ask the questions that would help protect yourself when you found out what happened to those who went before you. I can only say to you that representing the District of Columbia, where I have to fight for everything the district gets, there was no better experience in preparation than working as a young person, the way so many of you are today, in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the Civil Rights Movement.
Thank you. Congresswoman Clark, your mom was a trailblazer. Indeed, she is still very much part of your life and the lives of people who live in Brooklyn. Dr. Clark was a member of the city council. You followed in her footsteps, but there was one other woman who hailed from the great state of New York and the city of Brooklyn. Just recently, you helped to push forward a statue in her honor, one of the first ever woman who will be in a public park. Why don't you tell us about the Honorable Shirley Chisholm as well as your own path to public service?
Absolutely. First of all, let me thank our president, our provost, and the leadership here at Howard University. Say good afternoon to the student body here assembled, and to my colleagues Eleanor Holmes Norton and Karen Bass. It is great to share this opportunity to engage with you. I am just blessed to have grown up in central Brooklyn, New York, where the first black woman elected to the United States House of Representatives was my congresswoman, and that is none other than the Honorable Shirley Chisholm. I was coming of age as Shirley Chisholm's star began to rise in central Brooklyn, and she started out as our state representative in the state assembly, but we knew that her voice had carried so much weight in our state that it was inevitable that at some point when the timing was right, that she would go on to national prominence and to represent us in central Brooklyn. She was a contemporary of my mom, and so my mom and her did a lot of community organizing together. And because I was a child at the time, and at that stage, child care was not a right, particularly for black families, I was at every meeting with them. That was the child care. It was take your lunch box, take your crayons and your coloring books, sit in the corner and be quiet. But in that space, I was able to hear all of the concerns that were facing our community and the strategizing behind how we would overcome those obstacles. These women meant business, and it was a really, it was a great experience for me because growing up, I never felt as though it wasn't something that women couldn't do. So it was never in my mind that leadership was only a male-dominated profession, because I had seen women in leadership, rising stars in our community who were actually doing the work, who were drawing up the legislation, who were in the battle, activists and on the front lines. And so over time, of course, I started to engage in those types of activities. My mom, again, in the forefront, dragging me along with my knapsack, and just fighting the power, making sure that we could open up pathways and corridors for other people of African descent to run down. Because the movement, to a large extent in central Brooklyn, as I was coming of age, was really about the liberation of black people and how we could be self-determining about everything that impacted our lives. And the main issue at that time was actually the education of the children of our community. And I watched a lot of parents, a lot of mothers give up their professions, give up their treasure to make sure that there was a cohort of young black children who would be properly educated well enough that they would go on to do whatever it is that their hearts desired, whether it was vocational or advanced education. And so that type of service, that type of giving of oneself, I caught the bug. You know, there wasn't anything that I didn't do, particularly that was with respect to our immediate surroundings. I happen to represent the community in which I was born and raised and have lived all my life. So what I do is a labor of love. I'm really giving back to all of those parents that would be strategizing in the meetings and carrying forth really their mandate for making sure that our communities can advance uninhibited, undiscriminated against, and able to build from one generation to the next. And so, again, it's a labor of love for me. I studied public policy in undergrad at Oberlin College in Ohio, and from there went back into the movement. We took over our, I don't think that any of you students should do this, but if you should feel so compelled, we took over our administration building to make sure that our college divested from South Africa. I'm not recommending it, but they did divest. But it was, that type of environment, really an activist environment that really propelled my passion for service. I saw the victories, and I know that the victories are there when we're united, we're focused, and we have an agenda for upward mobility and movement, when we can speak truth to power. And that is what has, I think, catapulted my career in service. I started out at local nonprofits in my community, the same community that I live in, and I think some of the work that I did at the grassroots level was sort of my secret weapon for being able to galvanize a constituency behind me, because they had known me for service. And it wasn't something that, well, that's Una's daughter. It was, she has proven to us, because of the work that she has done, working with tenants in our communities that were not given they were not given their dignity in the housing that they lived in, working with parents and mothers who were trying to find childcare at that stage for their children still, entrepreneurs who were opening up businesses in communities that had been abandoned by so many others. And so today Brooklyn is all of that, because we did all the work on the ground to make sure that we could build strong communities that people would feel comfortable in living in and raising their children in and raising their families in. And I have to attribute that passion to the Honorable Shirley Chisholm, the trailblazers in my community, who made it known that leadership, yes, does come in the feminine, and that we can stand up, stand tall, and speak truth to power.
Thank you. Chairwoman Bass. Chairwoman Bass is the leader of the Congressional Black Caucus, the largest contingent of African Americans ever to serve in Congress. Congresswoman, you come from a large state, California, with 55 electoral votes. Some of us continue to count. But you follow in the footsteps of so many great and awesome members of Congress, from Yvonne Braithwaite Burke to the Honorable Gus Hawkins, Julian Dixon, who we know in the District of Columbia for many years, served as the subcommittee chair for the District of Columbia on appropriation, to Gus Hawkins, Ron Dellums, Merv Donnelly, of course, Juanita McDonald, Diane Watson, Maxine Waters, Barbara Lee, Kamala Harris. What's in the water in California? But you're the first ever African-American woman to serve as Speaker of any state assembly. What was your path to public service?
Well, you know what? It was a time period in which I grew up, the time period that Representative Holmes Norton was describing. And to me, it's similar to the time period that you're in now, where there's a heightened awareness of politics because of the crazy man in the White House. Everybody, even children, think about politics now. They know who the president is. That's how I grew up. So I was always involved in politics, but I never thought about running for office. That was never in the cards for me. I was an activist doing work similar to the work Rep. Clark talked about in the anti-apartheid movement, police abuse movement, all of the issues that were impacting our community. And then when the crack cocaine crisis hit, to me, I was just devastated. I thought that black folks were going to go the way of Native Americans, because that's the way it felt like at that time. And it was so obvious we were going to have mass incarceration. So I went to South Central Los Angeles, where I grew up, and started an organization to address the convergence between crack cocaine, gang violence, and deindustrialization, because to me it was a health issue, but it was also an economic issue, because crack cocaine had taken root in the economic fabric. And I had a health background. My day job was working in hospitals until I started my own organization. But we just knew, we were watching all the laws come into place. And so after building this organization for a number of years, we got involved in local city issues and then state issues, because we realized that there were a lot of different actors that participated in the drug industry. But yet we were only talking about incarcerating people who were addicted. Now that there's an opioid problem, we recognize that it's a health issue because it's different people, right? And so we fought to hold the other actors accountable. And by other actors, I mean liquor stores, motels, recycling centers that became focal points for drug trafficking. And then we fought for treatment for people who were addicted. And so from that, I wound up running for office because the person before me, Congresswoman Diane Watson, called me up one day. I didn't even know she knew who I was. But she called me up and she said, you've been in the community long enough and you need to go to the state legislature. And I'm like, well, what do I need to do that for? And she said, because there's no African-American women in the state legislature. So that made me feel, obligated. But then I realized I could work on the same issues in the state legislature that I was working on in a grassroots basis. And because I had been working in the community for a number of years, just like Rep. Clark described, when it was time that I got pushed to run, it was a little easier because I had already had a base over many, many years. And then the same Congresswoman, after I was Speaker and was getting ready to term out, she decided she was going to retire and then ordered me to Washington. And so I was happy to come here because Obama was president, Democrats were in control of the Senate and the House, and I got here and the Tea Party took over. So let me just end by saying it's such an honor to be here with you today. I mean, I look out at these faces that are here, and it makes me feel good, and I'm sure it makes the two of you feel good because we know you guys are coming. We need your leadership. We need your involvement, and anything that we can do to advance that. It's just very exciting to be amongst you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Now, many of you might not know this, but Eleanor Holmes Norton, Yvette Clarke, and Karen Bass all hold leadership positions in the 116th Congress. And I want to start with the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Congresswoman, you are on the House Judiciary Committee. And with the recent summary provided by Attorney General William Barr, what role will Congress play in trying to get the full report out to the American people?
Well, thank you for that question. We are going to get the full report. I mean, even Trump is saying he wants it to come out. That's because he don't know what's in it, okay? So the only thing we've seen so far is a 4-page memo of a guy who was auditioning for the job by sending a memo over a year ago basically saying that there's no way that Trump could obstruct justice. So he writes the 19-page memo auditioning for the job, gets the job, and surprise, surprise, he writes a memo over the weekend saying that there was nothing, it's all over, let's turn the page. We have to have the full report. We have to have the underlying evidence. And then there's investigations that are still going on. So this is just a very first milestone. We have a long way to go in this process. And then just finally, over the last 2 years, this administration has not been held accountable at all. No oversight, no investigations when the Republicans were in charge. So we're just getting started. So we have a long way to go in this process. The process, in my opinion, it might conclude before 2020, but it's definitely going to conclude by 2020 because we gotta move on. We gotta get rid of him.
Congresswoman Norton, you're on Government Oversight Committee, and recently you posed several important questions to President Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen. So what role will your committee play in making sure that this information get out to the American people?
Well, along with the Judiciary Committee, we have jurisdiction over this report. Now, you have heard that this report found no collusion. Don't worry about that. I never thought that the reason that they found no collusion is that the Mueller was bound to look narrowly at what the president had done. When you look at collusion, you don't have to look at what he did. All you've got to think about is the Russians. He didn't need to reach out to collude with them. They reached to him to collude. And we've seen when he went to Russia how he behaved as if he were one of them. So that question was narrowly framed. The more important question is obstruction of justice. Now, we saw the president do obstruction of justice in plain sight. That's right, it was recorded for posterity. Now, it's interesting that Mueller's essentially didn't say he didn't. He left that question for our committees to decide. So I intend to look at obstruction, which it seems to me is primarily what this president has done. So we come to Howard just as we are reading, excuse me, this report and giving you a preview of what oversight really is about.
I see you need some of my gumbo, Eleanor. That'll get rid of that cough. Congresswoman Clark, you are the vice chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Congratulations. You're also the co-chair of the Black Women and Girls Caucus on Capitol Hill. Maternal health crisis, that is a major concern for Black women. Can you tell us about that issue and what members of the Congressional Black Caucus are doing to address that?
Absolutely. Let me just add a little piece to this conversation around the new report that we've received from Robert Mueller. And I want to encourage students because we're in another phase now. As the materials were being gathered by the special prosecutor, I call that phase the awakening phase. That was the period where activism is at its height. As Congresswoman Bass said, the public has begun to tune in and understand that something took place during that last election. This next phase that we're in is what I call the enlightenment phase, which means that we have to educate ourselves on exactly what happened. And that's what the Mueller report is providing for us. That's why it's so important for us not to get weary or brush it aside. We need to know the details. And why is that, you ask? Because it can happen again. And our ignorance can bind us into a scenario that none of us want to be engaged in. And when I say none of us, that's the re-election of Donald Trump, because of all of the mechanisms that were put at his disposal in order to make him president. So this next phase is very important. We need to read the report. We need to see the underlying documents so that we know the methodology that went behind it. All of you who are here, as you go about your studies, I hope that you will look at this report when it becomes public so that you will have an understanding of exactly what took place, why it took place, how it took place, and that you will come to your own conclusions because you've been enlightened by the work that has been done by Mr. Mueller. Now, what is happening in our communities with Black women, particularly in maternal mortality and morbidity during pregnancy, is we should be sounding the alarm right now. Because in this day and age, with modern medicine, for Washington, D.C., New York City, and other places where we have high concentrations of Black women, for the medical practice not to have acknowledged the need for the prenatal care that we need, the cultural sensibilities of Black women's health, which is very specific to Black women, knocking down some of the stereotypes or tropes that they have about Black women in pain. I mean, it's unbelievable some of what our modern medical professionals believe about Black women, which is why the attention has not been turned to making sure that our health care is addressed and addressed adequately and appropriately. What the Caucus on Black Women and Girls is doing is we're speaking to medical professionals, particularly those who specialize in the health of African American communities, to look at the indicators that will tell us what are the areas or what are the healthcare imperatives that we need to highlight so that women, as they become pregnant, know what steps to take, what questions to ask, and how to go about safeguarding their own health care, themselves, and having a healthy pregnancy to term. So our caucus is getting information from across the nation, from various medical professionals, and we want to release that in a report to the public so that we have the best tools at our disposal to help drive down this horrible statistic in our community. The other thing, as a member of the vice chair of the of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction for healthcare, we're looking at legislation to compel study, research into exactly what is taking place, and then bringing in some of the major healthcare professionals for commentary for their testimony in hearings, so that we can get this information out to the public as soon as possible. But we need to, again, begin part of the awakening, understanding that this is an issue in the 21st century for Black women, for mothers who are in the midst of carrying their children. Their health is at risk if we don't have the proper health care protocols in place to help them to go through a very successful a pregnancy, and looking at both their health and that of their children.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And before we open it up to questions, I want to ask Congresswoman Bass, earlier you mentioned that we're treating the opioid crisis as a health epidemic, but we treated crack cocaine, powder cocaine, as a criminal action. How should we handle the racial disparities that plague our criminal justice system?
Well, I mean, I think our criminal justice system needs to be revamped from top to bottom. And one part of the criminal justice system, I would even question its existence, and that's the incarceration of children. Not every country incarcerates children. So, for example, you know, children can be arrested for status offenses. You know, that means something that you would be arrested for as a child, but not if you were over 18. So truancy, curfew. Why on earth would we arrest people for things like that, or even detain them? And so if you want to talk about the bail system, which obviously just keeps poor people in jail, if you want to talk about the legal system where we don't have appropriate representation, just every aspect of it. So, you know, to me, it's just very hard for me to see our criminal justice system different than what happened to our ancestors when they were enslaved. It just seems like it's a system that traps us, and it's very hard to get out of. And back in the day, when you were incarcerated and you were released, it was considered that you paid your debt to society. Now, if you're incarcerated, you have a life sentence. You serve it in prison, and then when you get out, you have all of these obstacles that force you back into illegal behavior because you can't work, you can't necessarily get a place to live, you know, et cetera. And so, and then can't get an education. And then the idea that we have turned a part of our criminal justice system into a for-profit industry, the fact that it's on the stock market, there's just something fundamentally wrong with that. When we pass, thank you. When 3 strikes was passed in California, we knew, and we waged this big campaign. We lost, obviously, but we tried to defeat it. But we knew when it was being voted on that it was going to require the state of California to build 12 new prisons. Well, what happened after it was passed? You had these rural communities that hired lobbyists because they wanted a prison in their backyard. Why did they want a prison in their backyard? Because they saw it as economic development. They knew that there were always going to be people to fill up that prison. And then to make it worse, when the census is done, we count the people in the prison, not where they're going back to, which then shortchanges our communities as well. So to me, our criminal justice system is really part of institutional racism in this country. And so it's hard to think about, yes, I want the sentencing laws to change, but the whole thing needs to be revamped from top to bottom.
Thank you. Congresswoman Norton, as a lawyer and activist working with the ACLU and others, you helped to get women reporters in the newsroom. You also, as chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, helped to write guidelines for sexual harassment and pregnancy discrimination. Now we have a new movement, the Me Too movement. What is your thoughts on this movement, and will it include issues of concerns to Black women and women of color?
Me Too was started by a Black woman. So let's start where it began. And it is spread to women across country. And it has already begun to do what my own work at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission could not do. What we did, of course, was for the first time to make clear that sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination. That had not been determined. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court indeed determined that sexual harassment is a form of discrimination against women. But with every important problem in society, as important as the law has been in my life and until recently, when I simply gave it up because I was going to be the Democrats would be in power and I was going to chair a subcommittee. The importance to me has been that the law cannot do it by itself. For example, how did we get the progress we have had as African Americans? Well, we had some mighty fine lawyers that started with the Legal Defense Fund. But until black people got in the streets, we did not get the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Fair Housing Law. Women have made great progress, and Betty Friedan, who was the first to write a book that kind of exposed the problem and awakened women, did her job. But women had to do their job by doing what you do in a democracy. You come to people like us and tell us what we better do if we are to continue to represent you. And so you get laws that were not on the books before. So I relish my time as a young activist because I believe that prepared me to understand my constituents and to do what people who elected you tell you to do.
Well, thank you. I'm going to turn this mic over to the students of Howard University. Would anyone like to pose their first question? Congresswoman, I have to tell you that reparations was on the top of their list when they sent me a couple of emails, but I know you will get to that. Anyone would like to ask a question, stand up and please state your name. And it's a question, not a sermon. Anyone? Oh, we have a microphone right there in the back. Yes, go ahead, ma'am. Is it on?
Good afternoon. I am Sophia Gertrude, a graduate senior commissioning political science double major in the Board of Commissioners County, Maryland, by the way of Trinidad DC.
All right.
It's an honor to be here with you today, Gwendolyn. But my question is particularly within the Washington DC community. There's gentrification, so that changes demographics, and I wanted to know what has been some of your challenges representing the city during a big period of change.
Well, I certainly appreciate that question, especially since many of you may have been victims of this gentrification. And of course, we have gentrification all across America, but especially in a city like DC, which is growing and seeing so many new people come in. And in our case, we have a limited area here. You can't just spread out into some other area. We also have a height limit, which means that you can't just grow high and try to take care of it. This is going to be the issue of your generation. You will graduate with degrees from a prestigious university. That doesn't mean you will be able to afford some place to live. Now, I won't even get into what you have to pay back for your education. But gentrification is essentially robs the next generation. Your parents have their home. You want your home too. But you live in a market economy. And there is almost so much you can do. To the lady who asked about the District of Columbia, you are, if you were to live in D.C., you are going to be very fortunate because the district is perhaps the most progressive jurisdiction in the United States. And for example, if they build a new apartment house, as they are around D.C., you will have to set aside a certain number of units for not poor people, but middle-income people. The reason it's not poor people is because poor people can't afford to live there anyway, and you can't make a market economy accommodate the poor. What has happened in the District of Columbia? People just moved out to try to find cheaper and cheaper places to live. This is something you've got to think about because it is going to confront you, and you're going to be at least able to deal with it as you go to your first jobs and seek your first success.
Next question. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Franklin, and I'm a sophomore legal communications major and political science minor by way of Kansas City, Kansas. And my question is in regards to the criminal justice system. When judges tend to be appointed, there tends to be a lack of accountability and transparency for said judges. And my question is, what actions can we take on a university level to ensure that judges are being held accountable for the disproportionate sentencing and unfair rulings?
Well, but I do think that we should answer that.
They just looked at me on this because I'm a lawyer, but I'm going to turn quickly to Karen Bass. In the federal system, first of all, calling judges accountable. If you're from a state, often judges are elected, and you can hold them accountable at the time of election. I'm not sure I am for elected judges, however, because of the ability to mess into the system and to get judges looking political. If you are talking about federal judges, and that's where we're in trouble now, because Donald Trump gets to appoint them, they are lifetime judges. What does that mean? It means you got to do your work for whoever is going to be the president of the United States, because in a real sense, what he does will live after anything we do, after anything that a president does, because these judges are appointed for life.
And you know, I don't know what you would think about this, Holmes Norton, but I really feel, and I hate to put this on you guys, but I really feel that this is going to be an issue that your generation is going to have to deal with, because they've tried gerrymandering, they've tried voter suppression, we've still been able to win. Now, they will steal elections. I mean, I do think that we have a governor in Georgia, Governor Abrams, who didn't get her seat. Her election was just stolen from her. But you know, the thing is that what I believe they've decided to do, since they can't beat us, when we organize, we win, in spite of voter suppression, in spite of gerrymandering. But what they can do is the courts. And so them filling the courts up with not just people who aren't qualified, but people who are openly racist, openly sexist. And so I think the next generation has to figure out an impeachment strategy, or a movement that demands something around this, because I can't accept that these people who are being appointed are there for life. And maybe when they came up with lifetime appointments, that's because people didn't live beyond 45. They're appointing 30 and 40-year-olds so that they can be there 40 or 50 years. So I wonder, in the long run, can there be some kind of movement that's created that kicks them out? How do we just accept that?
Let me just also add to that. There is something that we can do. We don't know whether we'll always be successful, but the CBC has been successful at impeaching the character of some of these folks that they have brought before the Senate to appoint. And that means that, remember that awakening I was talking about? We have to stay woke, because there are folks that are being plucked from our communities across this nation who we know have a record of discrimination, racism, and what have you. And when we bring that to the light, oftentimes they're ashamed. The senators are, and they will bypass, and they will not allow a certain individual to be brought up. I mean, it's not as frequent as we'd like, and I think that the CBC has been very successful with some of our candidates, but I think if the public engages as well, and I know we keep asking the public to do everything. Well, it's a democracy, damn it. That's what y'all supposed to be doing.
But you know, Donna, let me
Yes.
just one last note. That's another reason why this election is so critical next year, because we have to take the Senate back. We got 1/3 of our government back. We need the other 2/3. Otherwise, we'll have another 4 years of crazy judges.
Well, Congressman, you mentioned something about the upcoming election in 588 days. 588, some people count. Congresswoman, many of the students are concerned about voter suppression and tactics that limit their influence at the ballot box simply because they're students, or limit their access simply because they cannot vote at a certain hour on a certain day. They want to have early voting, non-excuse absentee balloting. What will the CBC do to try to strengthen voting rights in the 21st century?
Well, the CBC, actually, that is one of our #1 issues for this year. So I'm proud to say that in addition to having legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act from when it was gutted by the Supreme Court, but one of our former chairs is chairing a subcommittee that is looking at voting and what happened in the last election. Because, you know, the reason the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act is because they said, well, this is not really a problem anymore. But there was egregious problems within hours after the Supreme Court made its decision, and those played out in the November election. So we have gone to Texas, we've gone to Georgia, we're going to North Dakota for what they did to the Native Americans. So we are establishing the documentation of voter suppression so that that can be put into the legislation and we can get that passed. But once again, I would just say that in spite of voter suppression, when we organize, we can overcome that.
Reparations. I mean, Beto is talking about it. Bernie is talking about it. Okay, all right. She's corrected me. Bernie has not discussed it. But many of the presidential candidates, Booker. I'm sorry, I had my B's wrong. There's so many B's out there, and we're waiting for Bullock and Biden, so who knows, and Bennett. Reparations, H.R. 40 has been around for a long time. Will that legislation move this year, and if so, what's the fate of it?
Well, H.R. 40 is the way to approach it. H.R. 40 moves every year, which is to say it doesn't move, but it's been introduced every year for a very long time, and it's had that same number. What H.R. 40 does is to mandate a study so that when we say reparations, we know what we're talking about. This subject is being discussed wildly now, as if reparations is just something you ask for. Everybody in this room is generations from who really deserved reparations. There's none of us in this room. When you get to who got reparations, let's look at what the most recent what the most recent precedents were. We have had reparations. The Japanese, that was going to be the very first. The Japanese who were interned in World War II, guess what? The people who were interned and their immediate relatives still lived. They were due the reparations. They got the reparations. The Tuskegee residents who were victims of an experiment again got reparations. But, you know, look at, should Eleanor Holmes Norton get reparations? Be real. We could revive the Voting Rights Act. We could revive affirmative action, which is still alive and well. It is very difficult to come upon a remedy for reparations which would apply only to black people, that's who we're talking about, and who would apply to those who need it more. It would be shameful if we did not deal with those in our community for whom reparations is a real need. Many of us, through happenstance, through luck, through education, have gotten as far as, let us say, white people have gotten. Some of the white people remember, and you have to watch out when you say reparations. There are people who came to this country, whose parents came to this country as immigrants, the Irish and the Italian, for example. When they came, they worked 14-hour days. They are the ones that brought us the hours that we now have that don't allow you to work but 8 hours. The reason you got the temperance movement is because people will work so hard, those immigrants, that they died or drank themselves to death. So when you get to talking about your past, you got to be real clear, else what you're going to do is you're going to polarize the society. they're gonna point to why we deserve it. They're gonna do just like I did and say, well, I must deserve it too, because my grandfather was an immigrant. And I therefore would suggest we look at what we were able to get, what the civil rights movement got for us. It got for us things like affirmative action, which has been very instrumental for many African Americans in jobs and in education. And I hope we don't devote this presidential campaign to an issue like that rather than to more concrete issues that we deserve and can get.
Congresswoman Bass and Congresswoman Clark.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take on reparations, because I think the study is important in linking systemic poverty and understanding how, whether it's through migration, various laws in various parts of the country, certain descendants have remained impoverished over a certain period of time because those barriers continue to be erected, though that original, descendant was due reparations. And it's actually an international movement, quite frankly. I happen to be a child of immigrants from the Caribbean, and I know that the Caribbean has already begun a movement looking at England and what they did around reparations, and how they stayed colonized nations well into the 20th century. This study can redefine, and I think that that's where your intellectual capital can be really, really relevant and helpful, is that we have to re-envision, because I think what people are thinking about are 40 acres and a mule. Now, that's where it begins, or a check. But there are a whole host of things that I think that we need to look at, because there's not a system in the United States that is not based off the original sin, right? We talked about criminal justice. Well, we know how policing came about. We know that was all out of that same enslaved narrative. And so, you know, healthcare, the disparities there, you can go down the list of discriminatory practices that can be tied directly to being descendant of enslaved people, and look at what those remedies would look like. It may not look like an actual check. It may be an expansion on affirmative action. It may be, the opportunity to be included in policy making and conversations in the boardrooms of corporations across this nation. It could be a whole host of things. And I think your generation, because this issue has come to the fore, needs to be a part of that intellectual dialogue around it. If we allow people to say it's about giving black folks a check, that's when it becomes divisive. Because folks always, the whole battle, over the end of the 20th century was, those people on welfare. And for some folks, they define that as a reparation of some sort. There's always a derogatory way of looking at things, but I think we need to go back to the historical context, look at and we can do this analysis, right? Look at the descendants and the level of poverty that exists within our communities due to those practices that originated during our time of enslavement.
Congresswoman Bass, any thoughts?
Yeah, just briefly, I would definitely co-sign what my colleague has said here. I think that where you get off track is if the word, and frankly, I wish we had another word, because I feel that the word reparations has been so ridiculed. And it's been ridiculed because it is viewed as there's black people asking for something for free again. And you are making me pay for it as a white person for something I didn't do. Which is, again, as Representative Holmes Norton pointed out, reparations is not anything new. It's just ridiculed when it comes to us. So to me, what I would just suggest when you're out there debating this issue, if you focus on institutional racism, as Representative Clark was describing, and yes, if we address institutional racism, other people would benefit by it. but obviously we would too. And also institutional poverty. Just like I talked about the criminal justice system, once you get on that track, it's very hard to get off. It's also very hard not to be poor when there's so many different things keeping you poor. So those are the inequities that we need to address, and I would just suggest putting it in the broader context when you're debating the issue.
And I think that that's a good place in terms of movement, particularly around Black Lives Matter, because we never did truth and reconciliation in the United States of America. Never, ever.
Never even acknowledged slavery, how long it lasted.
Absolutely. And you know, I think that's the nut that needs to be cracked to a large extent, so that we all have the same baseline of understanding in education. Because one of the challenges we face, quite frankly, is the fact that we're all coming in on various levels of this debate and discussion, and we don't have the historic context or references that we engage in order to really make our case. And I tell people, we don't live in episodes. We as a people have lived in an epic, and we have to go back to the origins of where we find ourselves and make the policies straight, make our claims straight based on that historic context. You know, for example, what happened to wealthy communities in Oklahoma? Right? I mean, and you can probably chart that across the nation. Those, just all of the things that happened during Jim Crow into, you know, the civil rights movement and even post-civil rights. So I would want to encourage folks, the divestment of public school systems, right? When a certain group of folk left public school and black folks started entering, we just began to see the investment in education drop precipitously. How do we document all of that? How do we pull that into our conversation? And that's the type of work that we really need to do.
We have another final question for the afternoon before we allow the Congresswoman to get back to work. Hello there. Question. Will we return to some established norms, rules of behavior, rules of engagement, or has the Twitter-in-chief really set us on a new path?
Well, I don't think the presidency, we don't need to worry about the presidency. We need simply to change the president. I don't think he has changed the presidency. I believe that his machinations will inform the next president about how to really behave. Actually, we had the best example set for Donald Trump with Barack Obama. But his presidency has been defined by policies that move everybody back, and I don't mean just African Americans or women, and there is a cure for it. But the cure for it is not trying to impeach him, going for remedies that will make it, that are impossible, and if I could just elaborate on that for a moment, impeachment means that the House indicts. The Senate, which is controlled by Republicans, are who convict. I mean, how many times, I mean, we have a recent example of impeachment with Bill Clinton. He was more popular afterwards, and the Senate didn't take it up. Because in this country, we know how to impeach a president, and it's not by using one of these vehicles that hasn't been used since the 19th century. It's about doing what everybody in this room can do. 2020 is coming. You can impeach him if you go to the polls and get him out of here for good.
Congresswoman Bass? Congresswoman Clark?
The only thing I would say is that I think for you political science majors and those of you who may be engaged in public policy, that it's going to be important that you come to the table with innovation and creativity, because we're going to have to rebuild the federal government when this is over. It's not going to be what it was pre-Donald Trump. And it should not. It should be reflective of who we are as a society right now, the norms and values that we embrace as a civil society to advance us. Right now we see it's a generational shift to a large extent. A lot of the folks who are in the federal government as workers are retiring. They're like, I don't gotta take this crap, I'm out of here. You know, they've worked all their lives, they've worked under certain norms and constructs. Those have all been shattered, they're disoriented sitting there, and they're not replacing these workers. And so whoever is going to be our next president is going to have a mammoth task. Will you be prepared for service? Is that something you would be interested in? Would you be prepared for leadership? Will you be the next Madam or Mr. Secretary? What does your vision look like? What is it that HUD should be doing to push back against gentrification? What are the policy decision making? What does the HHS, the Human and Health and Human Services, need to be doing so that black women aren't dying disproportionately in childbirth? You know, these are the things that the academy where you sit right now should be gearing up for, because it's coming. And what will happen is that void is going to get filled. And it may be not filled by scholars like you. I want to challenge you to know that nothing is static. And yeah, there are norms, but a lot of those norms excluded our humanity. We now need to rebrand, redraft, expand our thinking around what those norms absolutely should be. If in the criminal justice service, in the criminal justice arena, we know that for-profit prisons should not be an ongoing endeavor in this nation. But what replaces that? Who's coming up with the policy prescriptions that will help us to deal with criminality at a point where we can re-invite people into the community? We can perhaps make sure that we can prevent things from happening by human observation, by being neighborly and knowing that that kid that you kept saying, oh, he's cute, but he's so bad, was the one that was going to end up being you know who on the corner, right? We see and observe behaviors and we know certain things, but we don't act. Now we have an opportunity. I tell people, let's get ready for after Trump, because there's a lot of work that's going to need to be done, and that day is coming quick.
Well, let's give our panelists a great round of applause. I want to acknowledge the Provost, Anthony Wuto, who is here. Thank you, Mr. Provost, for being here. I want to also thank the School of, the School of Political Science, of course, the Howard University Intergovernmental Affairs, External Affairs, and all of the others who helped us to get the Congresswoman here today. Of course, the staff of the Congressional Black Caucus. If you're interested in becoming an intern for members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the deadline is this Friday, March 29th. Go to www.cbcf.org/internship. I still know my CBC stuff. And I just want to acknowledge, in addition to Gwen and Colby King who are here, the King ambassadors, the young people that I meet with here on campus. Mr. Nigel Johnson, the great-grandson of one of the first black presidents here at Howard University. He's one of our ambassadors. Thank you all. Next week, we will have Tish James, the Attorney General from the great state of New York, the first black woman elected to that position as Tish James, Letitia James.
Going to hold somebody's feet to the fire.
There you go. And she will be our next in the series here at the King Lecture Series next Thursday, April 4th, the 51st anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. We will talk about criminal justice reform and many, many other issues. Keep in touch, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here on campus. I'm enjoying this experience. And Ellen, if you want me to come back as your intern, I'm willing to come back. God bless you all, and see you next week. Thank you so much.